Welcome to the Change the Game podcast, where we are changing the game by doing business differently and highlighting stories of capitalism at its best. I'm Steve Baker, and with me here, as always, is Rich Armstrong, president of the Great Game of Business and co-author of our new book, Get in the Game: How to Create Rapid Financial Results and Lasting Cultural Change. Hey, Rich, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Steve?
I'm better than usual. In fact, if I were any better, I'd be twins. Here's why. We have got a very special guest today. We've got Tim Garbinsky with the National Center for Employee Ownership. He's the communications director there, and he works with volunteers and allied organizations and the media to figure out the best, creative, most effective way to disseminate information about employee ownership, which is NCEO's mission, right? To get out there and teach people what employee ownership is all about. He got a BA from Duke because he's a badass, and he has since worked as a content creator, an educator. He takes all that skill and puts it into NCEO. He originally was from the Washington, D.C. metro area, and he's lived and worked and studied on 3 different continents over the past decade. He's got a real passion for other culture and all people, and he likes to read, write, and listen to and create music. So I think you guys probably have something to talk about there.
Right.
He's active whenever possible. Tim, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, fellas. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Well, you've got one heck of a background, very eclectic. I like it. But the one thing that really pops out to me is, we haven't traveled in a year. So I want to know what 3 continents you've been on. I hope one of them's Antarctica.
Oh, nope. That's still on the bottom of the list, unfortunately. One of them is North America, of course. Here we are. So the other 2 are Europe. I lived in Italy for a little bit, as well as France, and then North Africa. So I lived in Morocco for just over half a year.
Nice.
Oh, very cool.
Sounds like hanging around the Mediterranean sounds pretty good idea there.
You know, it's hard to beat so many aspects of that, mostly the climate, and it's kind of why I'm in the Bay Area now to a certain extent, is always chasing that perfect sort of 78-degree temperature, you know?
Well, with all that experience, what drew you back to the States and specifically to the NCEO?
Well, if I may be, relatively candid, I was overseas. I didn't have too much intent of coming back. There was an illness in my family, which has since resolved, well, so that's fine. But I ended up flying back to the States sort of in a hurry, and used up all my funds in getting back, and realized my only choice now was to work. So I did the typical millennial thing. I moved in with my parents in Wisconsin, and I got a few jobs, working class jobs. I was a butcher, and I worked the register at an employee-owned company.
Mm-hmm.
And it was while there that I started to sort of develop this passion for, good, equitable jobs and this sort of employee ownership culture. The job I had that was employee-owned, it was one of the strangest stores you can imagine. It's actually takes me a minute to remember all the things we sold because they don't relate at all. It was a pharmacy, a costume shop, a beer and wine store, and also a shipping place. So we would send stuff for UPS and USPS. Those 4
That's
things.
entrepreneurship. Yeah.
That's entrepreneurship is one way to call that, Rich, for sure. Absolutely.
Sounds like most of the parties I went to in college.
See, well, there's the connecting factor, Steve. I was missing that component. So it was while there that I sort of became resolved around 2 different things. One was that I never wanted to live anywhere so cold ever again. And the other was that it's worth creating and maintaining and supporting good jobs. That job was a basic cash register job. And these people were bought in. These people were engaged and happy to be there. These people were being rewarded for their time, in a way that they wouldn't have been other places. And that's when sort of I saw the position at the NCEO, and it was just sort of the perfect confluence of factors. So that's actually kind of the long story long, if I'm being honest there. But yeah, that's what brought me to the NCEO.
I have a quick follow-up, Tim. So
Please.
I've known you since you started at NCEO, and it's been great to watch your journey. But go back a little bit. So your first exposure to employee ownership was actually that job at the employee-owned company.
That's correct.
Awesome. And so what did you first think about employee ownership? I'm curious because I remember my first thought about it. I just want to hear yours.
Yeah. So I'm one of, I think, two people now at the NCEO whose exposure to employee ownership actually came via working at an employee-owned company. And my first impression was admittedly abstract. I didn't actually understand how it worked. I didn't understand the tangible benefits. And truthfully, I didn't work there long enough to be eligible. So as a material benefit, it remained abstract to me. But as a sort of, as an ethos or as a way of working, it was sort of very, very clear the way in which people sort of took ownership of their job, even in such small ways. Because when you're working as a cashier at a place that, you know, sells these very specific items, it feels like maybe you don't have a lot of control over your job, and maybe that can be true in some respects. But the way people really engaged with even the very minutia of things was very different to what was in theory like a cooler job as a butcher. And other jobs I'd had in the past. You know, I had a very varied working experience and work history until that point. And this was the job that sounded the most mundane on paper, but where the people were easily the most satisfied of anywhere I'd worked. So
Very cool.
yeah, exactly. It was sort of this instant recognition of what employee ownership could create in that respect.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm glad it brought you to the NCEO. So the NCEO I think just completed its 40th anniversary. And so it's been around a while, but and there's nothing like celebrating a big milestone anniversary in the middle of a pandemic, right? But I wanted you to give us just a brief history of the organization and maybe some of the accomplishments that you've seen over the years, maybe particularly last year, because I think you guys did an amazing job through a pandemic to keep this movement alive.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. I appreciate that question. And before I go any further, I also want to say I appreciate having this conversation with you two, because if I'm remembering correctly, my very first call when I was at the NCEO was with you two. Because
and you didn't
Steve,
leave?
You were on the board, and Lauren, our executive director, was like, "Oh, we want you to get to know people around the community, and there's no better welcoming committee than you two." So I appreciate you two having been there all this time, and then also being there now. But to answer,
we didn't run you off. That's good to hear.
Quite the opposite, Rich. Quite the opposite.
It was a test.
Let's see. So 40-year history, that of course predates my time at the NCEO, but started by Corey Rosen, who, you know, worked on Capitol Hill before it, sort of working on the legislation that would eventually enshrine ESOPs. So sort of one of the godfathers of this community, and he still works with the organization as sort of a senior staff member and just an overall guide for the community. And he started it in, you know, there's some debate. Was it his garage? Was it his basement? I'm not going to commit one or the other because I'm going to get it wrong. But he started it in a home setting and built it to be sort of the premier membership and research organization for the employee ownership and specifically the ESOP community. And since then, I'm continuously sort of impressed by the way in which the organization has made, you know, a bunch of little innovations, a bunch of little pivots, while always staying true to its membership and to its mission. Mm-hmm. You know, you specifically said 40th anniversary and sort of in the past year, and you're absolutely right. What a year to celebrate a 40th anniversary. But it really, you know, everything's a silver lining at a certain point with something like a pandemic, but it did allow us to sort of showcase our ingenuity and sort of shine in a little bit of a different way. So, you know, our annual conference, which is coming up, by the way, our 2021 annual conference is coming up next month. This time last year, we just made the decision that we couldn't hold our 2020 annual conference because of the pandemic. We had to cancel it just a month in advance. And in hindsight, and at the time, it felt like a crisis moment because that's, it's the center of our calendar year. It's where we go to recharge. There's so much planning that goes into it. Fiscally, it makes a huge difference for us. And we had a month to figure out, okay, we cannot safely gather what we anticipated would be around 2,000 or more people in one place. The year before, we had nearly 2,000 people. We had every anticipation that that year was going to be as big, if not bigger. And all of a sudden, we can't do it. And we felt that a real sort of duty to community to do something in its stead. We couldn't just cancel it. We couldn't just leave our community, especially in this great time of need, with none of the lessons that they come to expect from us. So in a month, and this is an enormous credit to our conference director, Yvette Torres, we shifted our entire operation online. All of the sessions were recorded, all the sessions had to be edited, all the sessions uploaded. We had to find a platform that would work for our members, that would also allow us to engage in a certain amount of ways. We had to do this in under a month. We had to figure out how to navigate the sort of contractual obligations we had built in. And we did it. We had a successful conference. I'm still baffled and impressed by what we were able to accomplish as a team. And that just sort of set the tone for the entirety of our 40th year. One of the things we did, a lot of organizations did this, but I, in conjunction with our executive director, Lauren Rogers, and events director, Jordan Boone, we put together a series of webinars free for the entire community about how to respond to COVID. So there were some cultural implications, there were valuation implications, financing implications, political implications. And we had 3 webinars with an average attendance around 600 to 700 people, all free, all organized in under a week and a half. We found speakers from the community because our community is already so open and giving, as you already know. And we were able to provide that sort of value to the community at large. We're big in sort of the cultural space. We tend to focus a lot on ownership culture and communications. And my colleague Dallin Garbinsky was able to start this new sort of culture and communications committee crash course, which is an online sort of networking opportunity. So again, it's all these, what look like maybe small innovations that really take root while also always keeping our members in sight, because really at our core, we're a member organization. It's who we exist for. It's what we create for.
Yeah.
And it's gratifying to be a part of, and I'm sort of proud to see us able to serve our community and see the community sort of thrive under this sort of tutelage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great story. Well, congrats on last year, because that's not easy to do. It's not easy to do. And it's cool how you guys rallied. And
you look so calm and collected at the conference. That's the weirdest part, but we we admire you for it. Well, you mentioned how you rallied the team and the community to create these free resources that help people take a lot of fear out of their organizations as they dealt with the onset of COVID and that sort of thing. As longtime members, I mean, we've been members at NCEO, at Great Game, and at SRC Holdings for decades. We've always benefited from the information and education that you guys are really the clearinghouse for. You have a new series called "Is an ESOP Right for You?" Or if I'm really reading it with some emphasis, it would be, "Is an ESOP right for you?" And that is free. This series is free. Why don't you tell us about that? Because I think the listeners need to know an example of what you're working on.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Steve, you should have been an actor, because that was a great reading. No, that's one of the new things that we're doing, right? So it's another example of sort of actually like an innovation that builds on something we did. So it's actually a smaller shift or pivot. We used to have several in-person, basically feasibility meetings, right? We had 2 different ones. One was ESOP nuts and bolts is what we would call it for a short period of time. And that was a 1-day series. It would take place at a local ESOP company, and people would hear the story from the ESOP, and then some practitioners would sort of take the rest of the way there of sort of how to do it. And then there was Is an ESOP Right for You?, which was actually a 2-day meeting series, which we now can no longer do, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of looking at that as a hindrance, which to a certain extent it is, of course, that we can't meet in person or what have you, it's actually an opportunity for us to just broadcast our message wider and louder to a certain extent. So we figured one of the main hindrances to the more ESOP and employee ownership creation is, barrier to entry, so sort of cost. And making this meeting online and free felt like a no-brainer. And it also made it easier for us to engage with companies that have these stories to tell of why they are now employee owned. So we just had our first one of those online free webinars. Is it already? I guess it was late last month. It's mid-March already. I just remembered. So it was late last month, but it's going to be a series, and we're going to maintain these videos online into the future. So we're hoping it'll become part of a sort of feasibility library of selling owners telling their story, and then having people like Corey or Lauren from the NCEO demystify some of the more technical aspects of it. The first one featured Ashley Walters of Onyx Inc. They're in Erie, Pennsylvania. She's also going to be our keynoter this year at the conference. Tremendous story and tremendous storyteller. So it's hope you'll be there for that. But it was really the brainchild of Jordan Boone, who I already mentioned, the events director, of, why not make this wider? Why not make this free? Why not do this regularly? This is a need that the business community has for better succession planning alternatives and easier access to that information, and we're situated to provide it, so why not do it? So that's a little bit around the genesis of it. The next one isn't yet scheduled, so I don't want to boost it up too much in that respect, but it is going to be sometime this summer. We'll do another version of this, and again, these videos will live on our website into perpetuity. So nceo.org, it's on the homepage right now. You'll see the blog post. But that's in short sort of where that came from.
So this idea of is an ESOP right for you is at the very front end of your process and your education. Why is that basic level information so important right now?
Steve, that's a fantastic question. And there's a lot of debate in the community around the best way to message this stuff. And I think after decades and decades, we as a community are finally coalescing around what is the best practice, which is getting business owners themselves to communicate to other business owners. That sort of peer-to-peer education is a component that was missing for so long. For so long, this sort of information was communicated by, lawyers or valuation experts or accountants. And, those practitioners are essential to the process. And, starting off with the technical aspects can be off-putting. And right now, especially in the wake of, COVID and the recession/depression that the economy just suffered from and is still, on the long road to recovery, many business owners are beginning to realize, especially in the sort of upper to later baby boomer sphere, that maybe they've held onto their business long enough, and maybe it's time to very seriously consider what that next move is. So there's a real energy around business transitions and the amount of sort of assets and wealth that are set to change hands over the next decade. And from where we sit, anything that can get this information into those hands can only be a positive. So, recognizing that need and recognizing that we don't want to create barriers, we don't want to be off-putting, was sort of elemental in how we've designed our feasibility materials, including this meeting series.
That's good. That's good. So tell me, Tim, what's NCEO's view on the current political climate, and what, if any, it might impact the employee ownership?
That's another great question, Rich. We actually just so many little innovations that you guys are giving me an opportunity to talk about. We just started another meeting series called Community Conversations. It's another free one for, like it says, the community. And it's going to be about sort of higher level topics that pertain specifically to the employee ownership field. And the first one was about employee ownership in the new administration, sort of what to expect, how it'll fare, and trying to read the tea leaves in politics is really a fool's errand. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know what's in store for us as a community. But by and large, the political environment for ESOP specifically remains positive. It's always been at least relatively positive, almost never negative. There's a lot of supporters on both sides of the aisle for the ESOP world, and that remains true today. Some of the appointees in Biden's, not necessarily the cabinet, but some of the other political appointees are those who we've actually worked with and who've been supporters in the past. Isabel Guzman will be heading up the SBA, Small Business Administration, I believe, and she's somebody from California that we've talked with and worked with and who has a positive view towards employee ownership. So, it remains encouraging these political developments, but so much of what happens on the ESOP sphere outside of political developments, ESOPs are already very protected as a political class to a certain extent. A lot of benefits for S corporation ESOPs, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be vigilant in protecting those benefits, but so much of what really impacts the ESOP sphere happens at the regulatory stance, at the DOL, and that usually happens in the career space. The appointees aren't usually the difference makers there. It's usually the people who worked in those organizations for decades. So, that's a little bit of a non-answer I just gave you, if I'm being honest, but I also think the closest I can get to safely saying we'll see.
Well, I think the important point is that, and I think you mentioned it, is that there has been a lot of bipartisan support for this for a long time, is that it's an idea or a concept that makes sense in terms of helping not only companies be more successful, but most importantly, that it gives opportunities for employees to see a whole nother level of wealth generation. And I think they recognize that and they've supported that in the past. And that's good news.
Absolutely. The bipartisanship can't be lost there. I think that just frankly speaks to the sort of win-win-win nature of ESOPs. It's the benefits are tangible and relatively obvious to anybody who looks long enough, for company, for employees, for community. And can't remember who told me this, but somebody once told me that employee ownership is the only idea on which the three Jessies agree: Jesse Jackson, Jesse Helms, and Jesse Ventura. So that should give you an idea of the sort of political universality of employee ownership.
Yeah. Well, Tim, you mentioned something very important. I think it needs to share this with the audience, is that you talk about the win-win-win proposition. You don't just say that, but you do have a lot of research that backs that up. So if the audience would want to visit your website and maybe even their membership, there's a lot of research that really checks this out to see if this really does make a difference. And it's very, very good research.
1000%. Thanks for saying that, Rich. Yeah, we're a membership organization, but one of our primary benefits to members and to the community at large is, I think, producing research that continuously shows the efficacy of these measures and of these ownership structures. One of the other ways in which we shifted in the last year, we do an executive compensation report, and last year it was time to do the new one, and it was a time of great struggle and crisis, but that wasn't reason not to do it. So we did it, and we also built in questions around COVID and around the responses companies are taking in the employee ownership community to COVID, and how they're dealing with these issues of, how are you compensating executives while at the same time furloughing employees? Like, how are you balancing that? What are the prospects for these companies? So it does have sort of the traditional research bent in there, and it also does take a look at, particularly in this time, what are companies doing and how are they responding to that crisis? So yeah, the research is, the proof is in the pudding. The research continuously shows sort of the benefits of these models.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that. So I joined 15 years ago at SRC, and that was my first exposure to employee ownership. Other than, going to a grocery store that says employee owned on the side of the building, then you slap the bag boy on the back and say, "It's good to be working with the owner," and then they're like, "Oh, get away from me!" You don't know what's going on, right? No education, nothing else. But I've learned so much, and I'm passionate about it. I've been able to generate more wealth here with SRC than the markets have provided. And of course, Rich has served on the board a number of times. I've served on the board. We're passionate, and everything. Everybody's listening. It's awesome. You should check into it. But let's, Timothy, get serious here. Put on your serious hat, and let's talk about examples. Some employee-owned companies have failed out there, and I'd like to know. Tell me a story about one of those.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I don't like to sugarcoat. I think I'm at base a realist. So I'm never going to come in here and say it's good for everybody, it works all the time, because there's nothing in the world that is or does, right? So that would be foolish for me to do. I think there's a few examples, and at the end of the day, business is business, right? So there's going to be some businesses that failed on business terms. And then of course, along with that, the ESOP then fails. ESOPs are not a fail safe. If your company is struggling and you adopt an ESOP, that's not going to all of a sudden make it a successful company. That's not how these things
great
work.
Point right there. It's not a magic pill. It's not going to make everybody, unite to save the company. That's for sure.
Not at all. Not at all. And it's one of those things where when we're talking about sort of a checklist for companies that are considering this, there's a lot of things that sort of go into that. But one of the most basic is your company already experiencing success? Are you already able to build year on year? Are you experiencing growth at a stable clip? Because if you are an unstable company, you're going to still be an unstable company. It's not going to change the nature or the identity of a company just by implementing it. Not at all. These things take sort of nurturing the way that anything does. As far as ESOPs go, there's a few high profile failures that have, I think, unfortunately sort of damaged the reputation of ESOPs at large. So one of the biggest was in United Airlines. And it's one of those things where United Airlines, clearly not a failure of a company. They're still flying people around the world in the middle of a pandemic. So they got to be doing something right? I think anyway. But it's one of those things where it also, you got to prime your company for it in ways that can be maybe hard to see, right? And I'm a very pro-union man, so this is not negative union talk for me. I think unions and ESOPs can live side by side successfully, and there are examples of that. But there were some issues with the implementation of the ESOP at United where I believe the pilots union wasn't necessarily on board. The flight attendants union had issues with it. And there are a few other things. I don't know the case study well enough to speak authoritatively on it. So I'm going to stop there and say that internally, it was a successful company that still wasn't primed for ESOP ownership in the right way. We actually, with the last Is an ESOP Right for You that we did, the online one, there were a lot of questions we had. So many questions, and we couldn't get to them all at once. So I and Lauren, our executive director, we did a brief Q&A follow-up. And in that follow-up, actually, also available on the exact same page and that exact same blog post on our website, Lauren details the United story and sort of what went wrong. And I'm going to invite you to visit the website and watch that video and learn from him, because he's a far more authoritative speaker on these things than I am. So I would encourage you, if you are interested in what went wrong at United, there's a few lessons to learn there.
Very good. Very
Well,
good.
I like the fact that you're pointing out that it's an ESOP is a way to make a transition in ownership, to empower people in a different way, to enrich them in a different way, to show a long-term strategy for growth in people, both professionally and monetarily. But then, it isn't going to fix your company. And so I think that's something for the listeners to really pay attention to and say, hey, let's fix the business. Of course, that's what Great Game is all about, right? That's why I think Great Game and employee ownership go well together is, run the business well, and then you can not only do well, but do good as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Oh, agreed. And I really, just to highlight y'all, one thing I like about being at the NCEO is we're not like the sole purveyors of knowledge, not at all. We're very frequently, usually a conduit for other people's knowledge, because as in any field, expertise is diffuse. Certain people have different expertise and we can all stand to learn from them. And if I can, gas y'all up just a little bit, I always enjoy the great game sessions, maybe the most out of any at the conference. When we were in person, they were, we would have to sit in on the sessions to sort of monitor things and provide aid. And I would always choose y'all sessions first because they're the most engaging, the most interesting, and the lessons are applicable sort of in things outside of just ESOPs. They're just good, solid business and life lessons. And I've always respected and admired that about y'all. And if I may, I know y'all are doing a pre-conference session for our conference. So it's going to be great. It's only $50. It's on the 16th of April. And I imagine so many of your listeners already know this, but in case you don't, I encourage you to attend that because I know it's going to be fantastic.
Well, thank you for that, Tim. $50, that's quite a bit for Steve and I for a pre-con. You may have overpriced it there a little bit.
Shooting for the stars.
So, hey, getting back to reality as well, that same kind of position Steve was talking about is that, it has been 40 years of really pushing on this idea of employee ownership. And there, unfortunately, still is a relatively small community of employee-owned companies. And I was just curious about, why don't you think more people haven't explored this and looked at this as an option for ownership transition, but also maybe where NCEO sees it going in the future? Do you see a tipping point? Do you see it where, where do you see the growth of this kind of idea in the future?
Yeah, no, that's an important question for the community. So it definitely has to be asked. So I appreciate that, Rich. Why there aren't as many to now could be so many reasons. The reputation around employee ownership is partially the one that I just detailed with United as one that creates debacles, which is just not true. Debacles can be created out of it, but ESOPs in and of themselves don't necessarily in any way, shape, or form contribute to that. But beyond that, they have a bit of a reputation as being more complex or more expensive. And there are examples where that's true, but I think also by and large, people underestimate in general how expensive or how complicated it can be to sell one's business anyway. Selling to an outsider, selling to management, all of them have their costs, all of them take time, and there's no one set path or no one set track in how to do it or how it's going to go. So I think part of it is overcoming those like preconceived notions that a lot of business owners have. Yeah. And then the other is honestly, it's a sheer awareness thing at a certain point where, these things aren't being pushed with the money that private equity has. The main purveyors and the main advocates of employee ownership and ESOPs are companies like yourselves who don't have any sort of fiscal stake in doing so and who don't have a budget to go around proselytizing on it either. You can't go to companies and try to convert them. And us who are nonprofits. So we can't compete in the same way with the sort of noise and visibility that something like private equity can generate, right? But there is a little bit of, maybe now is the tipping point. We've been saying that for years. So I want to be a little bit cautious in saying that it's right now, but I do think we are at a little bit of a watershed moment with the sort of visibility of sort of inequity in the country around income inequality, with visibility around how private equity has routinely, regularly, all across the board, gutted companies and moved them out of state, moved them out of country. And also of high profile successes of employee ownership being celebrated more globally. You know, the what are they called? I'm so sorry. Mondragon. Can't believe I forgot their name. Enormous cooperative in the Basque region in Spain was just, you know, universally lauded in the New York Times. When the owner of Chobani gave away shares of his company, it's not a ESOP, but it's a form of employee ownership. It was a universally celebrated thing. And so part of it is these things are being seen more and celebrated more. And I do think that there's been an uptick even since the start of COVID of how many sort of major publications are talking about employee ownership as a serious model and highlighting its successes. So, you know, we still have a long way to go. And I also want to challenge one thing, which is sort of the idea of what it means to be successful for the employee ownership community. The number of companies has been either stable or going down or going up marginally year on year. It really depends on how you're looking at it or counting it. But the number of employee owners growing is a success, right?
Yeah.
And when ESOP companies acquire other companies, that creates more employee owners, even if it doesn't create more employee-owned companies. And that's a different way to sort of track the success of the ESOP and employee ownership model and its growth within the business world. So I do think your assessment is correct, but there's other ways of looking at it that show maybe a more positive view as well. But by and large, the lessons remain the same, that it needs more visibility, it needs more demystification. We got to combat the myths a little bit more successfully. And, you know, just hope against hope that we're fighting the good fight and come out on top. You know, that's just kind of how it is.
You're definitely fighting the good fight.
Appreciate
Tim,
that,
how
Rich.
many employee owners do you think we have in the United States?
You know, I would usually feel comfortable answering that. I think the last tally was somewhere around 13.5 million with several trillion in assets, but I won't quote research authoritatively without consulting research director Nancy Wiefek. I don't want to upset my dear friend and colleague Nancy. So I will say the numbers can be found on our website, then they're up to date and you can check it out there.
So there you go. So how can our listeners not only learn if 13.5 million employee owners is correct and probably win a small prize, but also they could get registered for maybe that you know, kind of beginner series, you know, as an ESOP right for you, get registered for the conference and basically learn more about National Center for Employee Ownership at large, and just kind of get acquainted with the massive amount of resources you all have. How do they find you?
Fantastic. So I'm going to recommend 3 different things, and depending on sort of your level of interest, I think it'll fit any number of reviewers. If you just want to dip your toes, if all you're trying to do is learn a little bit here and there about us, learn a little bit here and there about what's going on in the community, the easiest, lowest barrier thing you can do is subscribe to our email bulletin. It's completely free, of course. Send it out twice a month, and it has just a compendium of sort of our blog posts that detail what's going on in the community or sort of news highlights, as well as upcoming events, new publications. For instance, we just published an updated and revised ESOP committee guide for communications. We have Beyond Engagement, which is applicable to wider than the ESOP community. It's just cultural lessons. And I know SRC is actually featured pretty prominently in that publication, since y'all are such a fantastic example of so many different things. So if you're just trying to dip your toes, the first thing I would say is, yeah, sign up for the newsletter, or excuse me, for the bulletin, and sort of get a feel for what's going on in the community. Beyond that, the next thing to do is probably become a member. You know, like I said, we're a membership organization, and we have a lot of stuff that's available to non-members, but the real benefits kick in when you're a member. So we have weekly webinars that touch on all variety of topics. We've built in a networking component to them. We have a newsletter, which used to be every 2 months. Now it's every month, and that has research, that has news, that has interviews, that has highlights, and that's member only. And then also you get discounts on everything we do. So our publications become discounted. We actually have a new sort of introductory membership tier, which is ESOP Essentials. It's aimed at business owners who are just starting to learn. There's a curated component, a PDF, and a web page that guides you through which webinars to rewatch, which articles to read if you're kind of exploring ESOP feasibility. But it's also just a good way to get acquainted with our resources. Again, that's called ESOP Essentials. You can find that on nceo.org. And last, but maybe the best way is, like you said, get registered for the conference. It's a shame that it's not in person, but the good news is you can register anytime between now and the 15th and be ready to learn from wherever you are. It's a great way to get a sense of who's in the community, what the community talks about. And if you are a member, of course, it's discounted. And you can do that. You can get registered there at annualconference.nceo.org. And I would say that's any of those three is good, and they all build on each other. So you don't want to do just one, you can do all three and you'll gain something from all three.
Great.
So long story long again, that's what I would recommend somebody to do if they're interested.
Well, I've always promoted the NCEO as a huge resource on employee ownership, and you guys never fail to support that and deliver on that. So there's plenty there. There is definitely plenty there, and at a fairly inexpensive rate. So that's true as well. So we've covered a lot of topics, Tim. Just one last question for you. Is there any one question we should be asking you that we haven't?
You would think I'd be prepared for that question, and somehow I'm not. I think people should ask me less questions, if we're being honest, but what do people usually say at this time? What do other people like to be asked? I want to live in other people's shoes. So what do other people like to be asked?
Well, what more should the employee ownership community, or I'm sorry, our audience should know about the employee ownership community?
There we go. See, that's good. See, you're doing my job for me, Rich. That's how good of a board member you are. You do my job for me. I don't deserve such kindness. That's actually great.
People.
That's right. No, you're fantastic. I think, for those who aren't already a part of the employee ownership community, it's a welcoming space. Everybody is invited to learn more. Everyone can benefit from learning more, even if you're not in a position to create or transition a company to employee ownership. You can still benefit from some of the practices that are implemented at employee-owned companies. A lot of it is just best business practice, right?
Yes.
But by and large, I guess what I would tell people is, now is the time for these important things to really start taking place. So if there's any way in which you can be active and can be a supporter, and that doesn't necessarily mean fiscally. You don't have to, find the donation page on nceo.org. It's as simple as, talking to people about what this is and how good it is and how this can make a difference. And when you see it, supporting it, put your money where your mouth is and shop at employee-owned companies, for example, when you get the chance. These things, if it can feel like where you spend your $40 on groceries, or I just way undervalued groceries, but it can depend. It feels like those things might not matter on such a micro level, but the macro is created from the micro. So these things matter.
That's great.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. Well, we're big believers in trying to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and employee ownership is definitely a huge way to make steps toward that. So thanks for being with us on the podcast, Tim.
Thank you both so much for having me. I appreciate the time. I'm enormous admirers of you guys from my very first day at the NCEO. That story remains true. And anytime I get to engage with y'all and build this community to be, bigger and better, I'm happy to be there.
Well, great. Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot. You can learn more about the National Center for Employee Ownership at nceo.org. And it's filled with people like Tim Garbinsky, who are just awesome and passionate about the subject. And we're also big fans. So let's keep the conversation going, guys. Send us your questions, your stories, your best practices, your challenges, and your victories. And remember, you are not alone. That's what this community is all about. That is capitalism at its best. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.